all of us, to be alive, need energy. And so really the difference when we talk about organisms is just where they get their energy from. Now there's going to be two main groups. You've got some individuals that will typically get their energy from light, and the light will be used to be stored into organic chemicals. So that'll be like proteins, lipids, ultimately nucleic acids, and carbohydrates. And so it'll be stored in these organic molecules, and then those will be converted in our bodies to ATP if we need energy. Some of them will be used for structure, so that we exist. You know, we have phospholipid membranes we've talked about. We've got proteins in our membranes, DNA's nucleic acids. We've got sugar we use for quick energy. So we're still going to have organics regardless, but ultimately we convert these organics into ATP when we need specific energy our cell can use. Now there's another strategy. Another strategy is that you just essentially ingest organics and you convert that to ATP. Now obviously that's going to have some limitations because you still need to figure out where you're going to get your organics from. And so typically you're still going to have to intertwine these because these guys can make organics. Organisms like humans can't. We have to get it from somebody else. And so that's why we're always looking to try and eat something, whether it's a plant or an animal. Something's going to get eaten for us to live. Now, looking at this a little bit more, the idea would be then, why can't we use light to make energy? You know, I can go sit in the sun, and aside from getting badly sunburnt, I would be able to feel the heat on my skin. I'd be able to see the sunburn that I got to show that I absorbed energy. So the idea there is, why can't I, as an animal, as a heterotroph as we would call it, why can't I use the energy and light to go through and make organic chemicals? Why can't you just sit there in the sun watching TV and feel full? And the idea here is that organisms will be able to use different types of energy differently. And so in our case, not all energy that we're going to come in contact with will be equally useful to us. Things like heat energy are almost never useful except to stabilize our enzymes. We've talked about they have an optimal range of operation, so it is useful to be at a certain temperature to keep them working. But in terms of storing that energy, like converting that thermal energy to something else, it's not going to happen. And so the heat energy that we produce is typically going to be essentially wasted. We can't put it to use. We can't convert it to something else. That doesn't happen. Whereas if you're a plant, if you're an autotroph, you will be able to take light energy and you'll be able to access it and convert it in a way that you can convert it to essentially be chemical energy. In this case, the chemical energy is stored as organic compounds. We can take chemical energy and convert that to ATP and convert ATP to change shape of things, to pump things, to move things. But we can't do this initial step of converting light to chemical energy because we lack the proper enzymes, we lack the proper pigments, we lack the structures essentially to make that happen. So even if you can get some of the energy from something like light, we can't convert it properly to anything other than heat, and heat essentially in an organism will always be kind of, I don't want to say completely wasted because it can have some small uses, but it, for the most part, is going to be not very useful to that organism, especially not at converting it to anything else. All it can do is make you feel warm. After that, it's not going to be able to be stored to be used at a later time. Now, of the two groups we're going to talk about, autotrophs are the ones we'll bring up first because these guys are necessary first. When we talk about autotrophs, these are guys that will make organic compounds using something. Now, technically, you don't have to use light, but we're going to focus on organisms primarily that will use light and convert the energy in light to organic compounds. And so we will typically refer to this process as photosynthesis. And this photosynthesis process is not going to be just plants. You'll see that plants do this. In the water, you'll see there's not usually many plants. It's primarily algae, which are still eukaryotes. They're plant-like. You know, plants actually evolved from algae. But this will be things like seaweeds. There's some of them are single-celled. So these are kind of like the simple, older version of plants. But you'll see these a lot in any type of aquatic ecosystem. So you'll see plants are at the basis of this terrestrial, this land-based food chain. But when you look at the food chain here, there's these smaller guys. These are algae. And so on land, and if I could do it properly instead of algae, You'll see plants will be used if it's a land thing, algae will be used if it's an aquatic thing. There are also some bacteria, usually they're called cyanobacteria, that will also do this. So even prokaryotes are capable of doing photosynthesis. So while I'll oftentimes say plants do photosynthesis, because they do, I don't mean to say that only plants do photosynthesis. That would be improper, it'd be wrong, it's just not true. Most things that do photosynthesis are probably not plants because most of the earth is covered by oceans, and it's in the ocean that we see a lot of these cyanobacteria and a lot of the algae. And so there's a lot of those guys that are doing this too. And we tend to call them producers because they're the ones that are taking the energy and converting to produce these organic chemicals that can then be used by the rest of the food chain. So you'll see the rest of it's going to be animals. At least primarily for these food chains. And so these early on, these producers, these autotrophs, whatever you want to call them, they'll be eaten by simplistic, smaller animal-like cells, which will then be eaten by larger guys, larger guys, larger guys, until eventually we max out and we reach the top of the food chain. So we have to have these guys or some autotroph at the base of the food chain or it collapses, because somebody has to make these organic chemicals for the other guys to eat above them. And the guys that are eating those things will be called heterotrophs. So troph eating, hetero, they're doing something different. They have to eat somebody different. They can't make their own food like an autotroph who make their own stuff. And so these guys are going to eat or absorb all the organic material that they need, which they will then break down to make ATP. And so this is everybody aside from the autotrophs. This will be guys that are decomposers breaking stuff down. It'll be all the guys that are predators. And we will refer to them usually as consumers. Sometimes you might see the word detritivores for guys that break stuff down specifically, but normally we'll kind of package those all as consumers as the term. And so these guys, because they have to eat or ingest organics, they will be dependent upon the algae, the cyanobacteria, or the plants that are going to be producing the food. And once again, I'll say food, but I mean all organic molecules. For the plant, they're just building more cells. They're not thinking like, oh, I'll be a nice snack. They're building stuff for their own use, and it just so happens that we don't mind killing them to help ourselves out. That's just kind of how nature works. And the last bit is not everything is photosynthesis. I know it's so easy to just go, autotrophs do photosynthesis, and autotrophs are plants. But I want you guys to realize there's more nuance than that. So in reality, almost all autotrophs do photosynthesis. I mean, almost, 99 point something %. But there is a small group of organisms that are chemoautotrophs, not photoautotrophs. So what that means is they do chemosynthesis, not photosynthesis. They'll use chemicals and they'll extract energy from these chemicals to allow them to build organic molecules. So the end result is the same. They have organic molecules, they can live. But they're going to get them by using things like hydrogen gas. They're going to get them by using hydrogen sulfide, that's the rotten egg-like smell. And in some cases, they can use even things like ammonia or radiation, lots of weird things. So an example would be in deep sea thermal vents. So this is, in some cases, miles down in the ocean, where there's kind of like volcanic activity that's real near the surface. So it superheats the water and gives off some of these chemicals like hydrogen gas or hydrogen sulfide. And there are bacteria, this is some images of them, that can actually use those to go through chemical processes that allow for them to make their own organics. And there will be organisms there that actually have these guys living in them. And so these guys produce energy, which then feed these tube worms. It provides them with nutrition. They don't have a digestive system. They just have these guys produce their food, these bacteria, which allows for these tube worms to live. And then you'll see other stuff like crabs and whatnot that will feed upon the stuff that's there. And so we can get a whole ecosystem that still has an autotroph at the bottom. It still has these chemosynthetic bacteria at the bottom. But it's not dependent on the sun. So in the absence of sunlight, most of everything would collapse. Almost every food chain would collapse if we take away the sun. But there would potentially still be some, at least for a while, that would hang out, that could use these chemical processes that go on in specific conditions where they could still live. So all life on Earth wouldn't have to disappear. There'd be some things left, but the vast majority would. So if I talk about autotrophs, I'm almost always going to be talking about photosynthesis. But if I bring up something that's using chemicals and not light to provide the energy source, that's chemosynthesis. That's one of those special cases. Hope you guys enjoyed this, and I'll see you soon.